Thank you, Meg. Welcome back, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you again, and I'm very grateful that you've chosen to move right along with us. Although I don't want to assume that that's a reflection of admiration or a call for an encore. It could also be the come on, we're going to give you one more chance to get it right, and that's it. Either way, thanks for coming. I just noted that this is being recorded. I mentioned that only because this morning I had an inquiry from one of our class who will be here with us now, but will have to be going for a dentist's appointment from one form of suffering to another. And he was hoping that the part he wouldn't be here to hear would be available to him. So now we have our answer. We've got a lot to do. You have been good enough to send me lots of questions. I have received about 15 questions in the last week. I have responded to some in part by email, and I will get to as many of those as I can. What I'd like to do today is see if we can find some, perhaps stumble upon some coherence here, but without any real determination to do so. A lot of the questions overlap. They go in many different directions. They are all very good, very interesting. I'd like to be able to discuss them all, but they don't necessarily flow in any linear fashion. So we'll see. So let's not look at this as a yardstick, but more as like a kaleidoscope. And hopefully by the end of our time together, those beautiful little chips of glass will settle into some sort of pattern that will be all the more exciting for us. Let me offer just a few introductory remarks, just so we remind ourselves how very old our topic is and how very new our topic is. First, let's just go back for a minute to 1787. The convention in Philadelphia ends. The people go back to their states. James Madison goes into depression. And I hope, again, that you will have the chance to read Joseph Ellis's The Quartet, because he really explores this. And he and other historians have helped us understand that following the Constitutional Convention, Madison was very, very down, went into depression because he thought that he and his colleagues had failed. He was devastated by the failure to address and resolve the issues of slavery. He was really discouraged in a lot of respects where he believed the founders had not reached their goal. And he went into what perhaps professionals today might refer to as an episodic depression or a clinical depression, whatever it was, he was deep down in the dumps. And his friends, including those co-conspirators, Washington and Jay and Hamilton, tried to write him out of it. And through their correspondence, which has survived, we know that they were successful in bringing him back up because they basically said to him, Jim, you didn't fail. We didn't fail. We only failed if we are believing that our purpose was to resolve all issues for all time. No, there was never any chance of that. We resolved some, we tickled others. We didn't get there all the way. But the key thing to remember is perhaps over and above any other single goal, our effort was to establish a structure for all time, a structure within which we could continue to ask the questions, where we could continue to search for our goals, and where we could continue to do so non-violently. And we think we done good. We think we got it. We think by establishing this governmental structure and the balance of power and the three branches that we have set for all time, we hope and we pray, a structure within which we will be able to continue to address the most vexing questions, the ones we can identify right now, like slavery, and countless others for generations to come, so that we can address them non-violently. Of course, we have seen that put to the test in the last month. And so our topic is very old, and I pick up today's New York Times, and our topic is very new. Front page, here it is. The headline is, "Pushing to tilt states' courts to the GOP. Pennsylvania bill aims at judicial districts." And here it is. In a sense, it's almost a dream come true for me. Finally, someone got it. I have been trying. I have sent op-eds unpublished to the New York Times. I have emailed Adam Liptick, their legal correspondent, who is superb. I quote him many times in my book. And I've said, come on, you're not getting it, or you're choosing to avoid it. As important as are the issues involving the US Supreme Court and the federal courts, 98.6% of all cases are decided by state courts, and you're not saying anything about how states select their judges and how very different those state judges are by virtue of the fact that all 50 states decided to not follow the federal model of the founders. No life tenure. Instead, we will elect judges, or we will appoint judges. In any event, we will jettison any notion of the very layer of insulation that you founders thought would always be essential to judicial independence: life tenure. We're going the other way. And now in this year, 2021, we still have all 50 states saying no to what the federal government thought was essential to judicial independence. And here it is. Here it is, as I warned in that little op-ed, as important as is the independence of our US Supreme Court and federal judges, let's not be distracted. Let's not let the magicians get us to look over that way when we should be looking over this way as well. Or at least, like a good driver, keep our eyes constantly moving. I can tell you, because I read this newspaper every day, and I have been hoping, waiting for the time when someone might bring to the front page issues of how state judges are selected. And here, this story focuses on the most recent development in an effort to influence that. And the story tells about the laws emerging in various states, the proposals emerging in various states, focusing on Pennsylvania and its efforts to do what? To gerrymander judicial voting districts. Let's be blunt. The right wing, in its insatiable desire to control decision-making in America, is not content with the state legislatures where it's been so successful. It understands the significance of judicial decision-making and the significance of controlling state judiciaries, state Supreme Courts, and state lower courts. So, as old as Madison and his depression, as current as an impeachment trial and its implicit examination of whether we have a structure where we can continue to approach problems non-violently, and as current as today's newspaper and the most recent legislative initiative to control the selection of judges. Those are my introductory remarks, and I've got lots of wonderful questions that could take us through the whole day. Meg and I are going to do our best to jump back and forth, and I'll defer to Meg to see just how how mechanically we should approach these. Meg, do you want to start with something from the gallery or something from the emailed questions?
We do have one in the chat. Mr. Metz asked, could you discuss ex parte hearings, their effect, and why they are constitutional?
Could I discuss ex parte hearings, why what, and whether
their effect and why they are constitutional?
Okay. I wouldn't expect everyone to know what an ex parte hearing is. An ex parte, and I never took Latin, so I hope I don't do Latin an injustice now and in other questions, but an ex parte hearing is simply where one party in a case communicates with the judge without the knowledge and or presence of the opposing party. In almost all cases, they are prohibited. A fundamental tenet of judicial decision-making is that a judge makes decisions, a trial judge, literally in the open courtroom for all to see. And a variation of that, an appellate judge goes through the decision-making process behind closed doors with colleagues, but ultimately the decision is rendered in open through a public written decision. And in some appellate courts, the process of oral argument looks kind of like a trial court, but with at least 3 judges up there on the bench. And there are arguments that are in the open. And in all these cases, one party gets to read what the opposing party has submitted or gets to hear what the opposing party is saying. That, a lawyer to judge, is the most common form of what is called an ex parte communication. It can go beyond that, however. So, for example, if I am presiding in a juvenile court case alone as the trial judge, and I want more advice. We raised the question a week ago whether I could confer with my wife. One of the written questions that came in, let's see if I have it here. Yeah, here it is. Question. In general, can juvenile court judges have private discussions with the specialists, the psychologists, pediatricians, social workers, guardians ad litem? It's the lawyer for a child. So it reaches the same point. So it's not necessarily a lawyer who might have ex parte communication with a judge. Is it allowed? No. In almost all cases, it is not. But once we go to that next level, there can be variations of that theme. And when I say next level, when we leave the lawyer or the litigant trying to kind of, grab the judge and say, hey, let me just tell you something. No, that's just not going to be allowed. Does it ever happen? Yes, of course it happens. It's wrong. It can be punished by professional discipline. But now let's go to that next level. I don't mean it's subservient or subordinate. It's different. A social worker, a psychologist, my wife. Is that permitted? And as I explained last week, go to 50 states, 50 different codes of judicial ethics. In some states, the answer is yes. In some states, the answer is no. And in most states, the answer is not so sure. Not so sure. But we do know this. If, for example, in a juvenile case, I thought I really needed additional information from a psychologist, maybe one who's already filed a written report for everybody to read, and I've got some follow-up questions. Can I get on the phone and say, well, doctor, would you help me understand this better? Or I've got a follow-up question or two. Many authorities would say, well, that's okay as long as, it's really not encouraged, but that's okay as long as the judge then does what? At the next available time, the next hearing in court, or in a letter to the parties, would say, parties, I want you to know that on such and such a date, I had a telephone call with Dr. Jones, and it was for the purposes of following up. And I asked Dr. Jones this, and here's his answer. Here's her answer. So, generally discouraged with certain ethical controls, there's some flexibility in allowing that to take place. Related to that, I think probably from this same person who raised the question about the psychologists and the social workers, there's an interesting comment. And the comment comes from, it says, all juvenile court judges have independent psychologists, social workers, guardians ad litem, caseworkers, and sometimes probation officers. So you're definitely not alone. Oh, if only that were so. And coming from your neck of the woods, I understand how that might be the impression. Statistically, in some respects, Fairfax County, Virginia, is the best funded county in America. When my wife and I did an in-service, Healing the Healers, for Fairfax County social workers, probably about 15, 20 years ago, and we had our whole song and dance ready about how emotionally distressed and compassion fatigued they were, our presentation didn't fall on deaf ears, but it fell on different ears than we had been encountering all across the country. As we talked about the exacerbating problems of caseloads and all of the things that complicate the work of a psychologist, a social worker, a probation officer, and so on. And we had heard, we had assumed something we should not assume. And we learned how, relatively speaking, how well-funded and adequately staffed the social service offices of Fairfax County were. And we learned in turn how relatively well-financed the judicial system was. It was the best story we encountered coast to coast. So the underlying assumptions of the question, all juvenile court judges have an independent psychologist, social worker. No, they don't. I wish they would. I wish they did. Fairfax County is in a very, very tiny little minority. And yes, there are many states that do provide some funding for those ancillary services and, I would say, essential professionals to help judges understand in a multidisciplinary way the key factors in addressing a case of custody and so many others coming to a juvenile or family court judge. Trust me on this one. There are judges who do that virtually unarmed. And it just ain't so. It's a tragic situation. And there would be so many times when I would say, look, I'm not complaining about the work. I'm not even complaining about the workload, except to the extent that it denies me the time to provide the careful consideration the case needs. But I am certainly complaining of my own ignorance. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a pediatrician. I'm not a social worker. And I sure would like to be able to draw on such professional resources so that I could be better informed. But I think I mentioned this last week. In a big community like Milwaukee, in virtually every case where I needed a psychological evaluation, I got one. And it came to me in writing. And there were 3 or 4 key psychologists who were very good, who generally did that work. And in those reports, averaging about 10 single-spaced typewritten pages, I could find all the information I would need. I almost never got to read those reports. If I tried to read them in advance, where I would have about 6 to 10 of those every day on the bench, There was no way I could keep them straight. I'm not that bright. I couldn't untangle all that spaghetti. Thus, I found within the first 48 hours of my time on the juvenile court bench that the best I could do, the people in the clerk's office laughed at me when I asked for the files the night before so I could take them home to read. He said, well, you're going to have a stack like this. There's no way you can get through them. You would need at least an hour per file. There aren't enough hours between your departure this evening and your return tomorrow morning. It can't be done. So here's what I did. Confession. In each case, and this is where I'm making the final decision on sentencing of a delinquent, the reform school, a treatment center, probation, going back home, or in an abuse or neglect case, foster care, removal from the home, placement back in the home, or with a relative, the best I could do, and it was a stretch, was when the case was called and the file, usually about 3 to 4 inches thick, replete with reports, I would go to the back, I would get the psychological evaluation, that typewritten report, 10 pages approximately. I would go to the last page knowing that these psychologists had learned that for the benefit of all, particularly the judge, they should try to get it down to 1 paragraph. Conclusion and recommendation. That's the best I could do. And that's a community that did have social workers and psychologists offering their recommendations. And of course, the psychologist wasn't the only one. I'd hear from social workers and probation officers, experts from both sides. That's the sad reality of resource under-allocation in America, and that's been true for so very long. And that's true today.
I think Mr. Metz has a follow-up question on that.
Yes.
Can you unmute and ask your question, please?
Yes. What motivated my question is, over the years, there have been laws and suggested laws explicitly allowing ex parte hearings in mental health issues, firearm issues, a few other similar categories where not only aren't you allowed to be at the hearing, you aren't even told that there's going to be a hearing until the bailiff shows up at your door. And to me, that sounds like a violation of due process.
Thank you. That's a good point. And that is true. There are exceptions to the general rule that I just articulated, and those generally come in emergencies. For the Milwaukee community, for the judges in the Milwaukee community, I drafted the guidelines, emergency medical hearings. A statutory exception, of course, search warrants. I mean, there are all kinds of emergency situations, exigent circumstances, medical hearings, and so on, where people know, look, if you take the time to formalize a hearing requiring both parties to be present, game over. The medical emergency will have evaporated because the person to be assisted has died. So there are ex parte hearings provided for by law. Are those violations of due process? They are not. Why? Because I say so? No, because the law says so. It says there are these exceptions, and due process, as we ordinarily understand it and recognize it, has to give way for the realities of life and death. So I'm glad you raised that, an important point. Okay.
There is a problem with that, though, that if once the order has been served, you disagree, the process of appealing the order is an extremely lengthy one. It is not treated as an emergency. And that is a place where I think due process is being violated. If there's an emergency order, then appealing the order should be expedited, and it isn't.
Well, we should not paint with too broad a brush. In some areas of law, It isn't in other areas of law. It certainly is. And just as expedited as was the hearing, the opportunity to challenge that also is expedited. It just depends what topic. I'm not saying it's that the statute writers have gotten it right in every instance, or that it doesn't from time to time do an injustice, but at least that is lawmakers' attempt to take that into consideration, judges' attempt to kick that into action. And let's just take a look at a recent example of a development of new law. In just the last, really coming with better understanding of the plight of battered women, there came to be an expedited process. It's unknown in law, unknown until, I'd have to check my records on this, but starting about 30 years ago, the whole process of emergency temporary restraining orders, or sometimes they were called domestic violence restraining orders, different states, different names. But there came to be an understanding of the need for an emergency expedited legal intervention to provide protection to a woman who alleged she had been battered and was in fear of her life immediately. Now, ordinarily, I guess in the perfect world, there'd be the opportunity for a hearing and the taking of evidence, but there was the perception that women were being killed or beaten because of the lag time. And so there came to be a process, because legislators were convinced, and not in every state, but in most states, there came to be new law providing for that kind of expedited process. And that would give the police authority to serve the alleged batterer with a domestic violence restraining order or a stay away order or whatever they wanted to call it. And most of those statutory systems also allow for an expedited hearing. And pretty much as soon as the accused is ready, the accused might want to quickly get a lawyer. But in most states with which I'm familiar, that hearing is often within 72 hours of the initial service of that paper on the accused. So it just depends what topic we're talking about. And the point's very important. We just have to be careful not to paint with too broad a brush and say, due process is being ignored or hearings are not expedited. Might not be perfect, but your very point is certainly part of the calculation as such laws are developed and implemented. Meg, anything else?
We have two discussions in the chat, and they're related, so I'm going to read them to you.
Okay.
The first one is from Mary Rowan, and she says, I agree with you. The system of lifetime appointments works well with federal court. I tend to think that elections or political appointments of the far greater number of state judges is a good check and balance on the federal system. Communities are vibrant and their priorities change frequently. Shouldn't state court judges reflect community values? And then Jeffrey Milstein goes on to point out, Pennsylvania judge refused to overturn the 2020 election results. He is a Democrat. GOP legislatures are seeking to gerrymander judicial districts to favor more GOP judges in the future. Are judges supposed to rule independent of their political, affiliation?
Yes.
Thank you. And several questions on that topic came in during the week. Let me just read one of those emails. Your point on the wisdom of lifetime tenure for federal judges is generally well taken. However, given the fact that many state judges are elected, including state Supreme Court judges, and given the fact that this electoral process is highly politicized, why would we want state judges to enjoy lifetime tenure? Indeed, The vetting and selection of federal judges seems to have become much more politicized in recent years, which begs the question, is lifetime tenure still a good idea in any context? And there were several really, I mean, that's nicely phrased and artfully posed, and there were several others every bit as effective. Now, I thank you for all of them. So let me start with what's easy. First of all, let's remember systems. We've got the federal system, we've got 50 different state systems, and a variety of others. So needless to say, if we were to take any single state's approach to this, I might smile or frown to different degrees. I think I mentioned, and if I failed to mention it last week, it's worth reminding ourselves. I am, of course, painting with a broad brush. And I readily concede, and I really point out, that we could look at a highly politicized state system. Partisan elections, say like New Mexico, you have to be a member of a party to run or serve as a judge. So let's take a highly politicized system. Frequent elections, contested re-elections. Some of those judges, so selected, are superb. They are proud, impartial, independent people who successfully say to themselves, all right, if you don't like my decision and you want to fire me, that's life.
After class, you give me a tutorial on the Mac Air.
Sorry? I
took care of that for you. I just muted it.
Okay. So there's some wonderful judges who appear where we might least expect to see them in highly politicized systems, just as a matter of honor, duty, conscience, strong ethical values, courage, whatever it is. They are able to set aside their preferences, their political philosophies, and make a fair call. On the other hand, we can go into the federal system and find judges who have life tenure, and they're awful. They're first and foremost forever Republicans or Democrats, liberals or conservatives, bigots or whatever. So let's appreciate that there will be exceptions at both extremes and lots of stuff going in between. What I'm trying to offer is the prospect of simply this. We have a much, much, much better chance to provide judges with the kind of insulation they need, the protection they need, so that their best practices and their most determined impartiality and independence will be able to merge, that they'll have a better chance to set aside the distractions, the biases, the corruptions, that they will have the chance to become better drivers who don't ignore the side view or the rear view mirror, don't ignore the people, don't ignore all of the things that could seem to impose political pressures, but they're not always looking to the point where they crash. We want them to be able to look straight down the road and not ignore the democratic popular pressures that I think they properly do factor in. To what extent? It's more art than science, more art than science. And to fess up, let me come to another question. Here it is. Well, actually, there's several. And one of them says, did you ever allow political and re-election concerns to influence your decision-making? Good question. And I mean, it's a fair question. That takes me to task. And in the course of writing my book on this very subject, I tried my best. I know, impossible. I can't be my own judge, but I did my best to be tough on myself to ask that very question. And rather than reaching conclusions in a few key cases, I left it to the reader. I said, was I fair? Should I have disqualified? Was I influenced by my religion, personality, political philosophy? And I think the answer to the email question, was I ever influenced by improper factors, including political philosophy? The answer is yes. Only Judge Mother Teresa could answer that one no. So of course I was. And for every time that I was, there were probably other times, many other times, where I felt such influences threatening. And I had to say, okay, I sense this. I know if I make this decision, there's some Yahoo out there who's going to decide to run against me and is going to put this decision into a 30-second TV ad with about $100,000 of advertising in the last week. I know that's coming. What do I do? And of course, I would say, I have to be strong. I have to accept the potential that I will lose my job. My family will lose its support because I've got this ethical rod up my ass and I can't be a little more flexible in my own interests. Am I really harming that party so much? And if I'm not a judge, I wouldn't be here the next week, month, year to make good decisions in 99% of the cases. So it's really the ethical rod up your ass question. And I felt it. Just trying to hold your attention. And I felt it. And was I able to deal with it properly? I'm sure there were times I did not deal with it properly. Not because I did something blatantly wrong or unethical, but because I couldn't completely keep it from influencing the decision. After all, while some judges think every single issue goes this way or that, it's binary. Reach the right legal conclusion, end of issue, go on to the next one. There are other judges, myself included, who look at things more holistically and realize that, yes, while many legal questions can be resolved in that clear-cut fashion, others are more nuanced. And in legal terminology, sometimes a judge ends up in legal equipoise. It could go either way, it could go either way. Flip a coin or slide ever so slightly to the side of my personal philosophical preference. So am I innocent? No. Am I human? Yes. Do I think I succumbed to that less than most? I think so. I was highly conscious of it and highly attentive to it all the time. But can I be sure? No. I was and remain ambitious. I always thought for the right reasons, ambitious to do good, to serve, to be courageous and heroic for all the right reasons. But sometimes those things get mixed up. Sometimes they blend. And I'm sure that I was sometimes not completely successful in my Quixote-esque quest for virtue.
Shelley Gerstein has his hand up, and can you ask your question?
Hi, Shelley. Shelley, I can't hear you asking anything. All right, well.
Okay, we'll go on to Lillian.
Okay.
Lillian, can you unmute and ask your question?
Well, I've got plenty more.
Well, I can see Lowell, so he's sitting there. So Lowell, can you Lillian got it.
I got it.
And we've got Lillian and we've got Lowell standing by.
Okay. A comment and a question. I appreciate your comment about judges being human. I know that in high profile cases, I've seen a lot of judges make decisions because they're afraid if they don't make a decision, like in a domestic violence situation, a woman's going to get killed. If they don't make the right situation, they're going to be in the front page of the newspaper on the next day. So, I mean, I've seen that a lot. So I think it's important for people to realize that judges are human. My question has to do with the lifetime appointments of the federal. I'm beginning to think that it's probably better for us to have term limits on federal judges and the Supreme Court, because we now have a Supreme Court that represents the minority view of the country. And when you have a Supreme Court that doesn't represent the country, and they're there for years and decades, it's unfair to the people. And I think that it makes more sense to turn that over every decade or so, rather than have them be there till they're 90 years old. And that's just my question to find out how you feel about that.
Well, I think that's a valid point. I think it's also, if we were to go to a system that offered, let's say the hybrid would be, you are appointed for life, but no more than, say, 2 10-year terms. So whichever comes first, your death or 20 years of service. And it's a perfectly reasonable proposal. And I think that'll get some serious consideration, so that judge does have the insulation, can't be fired. No one's going to run against that Supreme Court justice, but within a reasonable period of time. What we have to accept then is that the outcome, the philosophical or political or judicial outcome of that will come with the good or bad luck of the calendar. Let's just remind ourselves of this history. We had the court considered to be the most liberal court, maybe forever, the Warren Court, the court of Earl Warren with Brennan and Douglas and Thurgood Marshall and all of these fantastic liberal lions. And it continued to be the Supreme Court well into the time when politically this nation had moved more conservatively. And similarly, we might be looking now at a time with the same phenomenon, but with the philosophies reversed. So that becomes then part of the good or bad luck of the draw and the political calculation and a decision. It probably factors in to Supreme Court justices' decisions whether to retire. Within the last 10 days, there was, I think, a letter to the editor I read suggesting that one of the
Breyer,
thank you, Justice Breyer retire soon to make sure that President Biden gets the chance to appoint someone of similar philosophy and much greater youth. So some of that comes into play. So it's like that you take that piece of plastic, you lay it out on the desk, you seal it with duct tape on all 4 sides, and then you say, oh, darn, there's an air bubble in there. I got to get that out of there. I'm going to push it down and it moves over here and it just keeps moving. So who knows where that air bubble's going to move and what the impact will be. Last week, did I mention anything about what's happening in Poland?
I don't recall that.
All right, sometimes we learn so much with added international perspectives. There's something that is taking place in Poland now. It started about 5 years ago. Watch for the news on it. It's just fascinating. And here's what it is. Again, giving us a little humility as we approach this examination of how do we do this? How do we provide perhaps a better hybrid-like system for life tenure so we don't have people serving beyond the age where they should be trying to function in that way? All right. In Poland, we've got Poland, unfortunately, is one of the many countries where we have a wannabe despot, and his wannabe despotism is getting to be. And in classic formulaic approach, he has gone after journalists and judges and others. And he, like Franklin Roosevelt before him in a different country, came to be so furious with his initiatives being overturned by the US Supreme Court, the Polish Supreme Court. And the head of Poland, today's current leader of Poland, said, I got to deal with this. How do I get this nasty Supreme Court to stop doing what it's doing, upending my initiatives? And so instead of proposing the addition of positions, as Roosevelt suggested, as many were proposing during the presidential campaign here, the leader of Poland looked at the list of the Supreme Court justices. It's a big Supreme Court. I can't remember, but I think it's in one of my footnotes, but I think it's got about 70 members. Looked at their dates of birth, looked at the mandatory retirement age they had. I think they already had a mandatory retirement age, and said, what would happen if we pulled that mandatory retirement age back 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, and looked at how many of the current justices, particularly the ones voting against his initiatives, would be forced into immediate retirement, creating vacancies. He would then, by appointment, fill those positions with his allies. He got that through. I think that, again, check me in the footnote or Google. I think he dropped the mandatory retirement age from 70 to 65, but I could be wrong about that. That got him ample vacancies. But, it gets so much more curious. By virtue of Poland's membership in the European Union, a decision like that came under some shared authority of the European Union. And the European Union came in and said, oh no, you can't sneak that in through the back door. And right now, unless something is developed that I haven't picked up on in the last few months, there's been news on this at least in the last 60 days. Right now, in litigation, we have the head of Poland and that legislative initiative and the judicial authorities of the European Union. Bottom line is, we can look at all sorts of formulations. Biden, it is reported, is about to appoint a commission to examine issues like these to make recommendations for America's judiciary. And I would say there's room for improvement, but I think a commission's a good idea. I want to kind of almost like either a good chess player or someone who's going to figure out, okay, where will that air bubble pop up and do the least harm? And I think we're going to see, for the first time in a very long time, if this commission comes to exist, a careful analysis of such approaches to these questions.
Thank you.
This is Lowell. You mentioned Earl Warren, and I, when I was very young, remember seeing signs, impeach Earl Warren.
Right.
And the question I have is, what are the grounds in the process for impeaching either Supreme Court justices or justices at lower levels, including state levels?
Well, the impeachment of Supreme Court justices is under the standard in the Constitution, and we've gotten some recent lessons in this. If we were fortunate enough to watch the impeachment proceedings, and the standards are high. In the history of the United States, only one Supreme Court justice has been impeached. Back in
but who judges them?
Pardon me?
Who makes the decision?
Senate. It is impeachment, whether it's the president or a federal judge, federal judges, including Supreme Court justices, would be tried and, if removed by the US Senate. State courts, completely different ballgame. We would have to go through 50 state constitutions to see if there is any provision for impeachment of a state Supreme Court justice or judge. They might be called one thing or another. And why wouldn't we expect necessarily to find such impeachment process there? Because they've got other avenues. And some of those who are questioning my favor of life tenure saying, wait a second, at least the states have options. They can get rid of judges by election. That's true. I mean, you know, my air bubble is moving there. I'm vulnerable on that. And yes, indeed, there are times when wholly unsatisfactory judges are removed by virtue of election. Unfortunately, my sense of history and my experience is that more likely, however, we see the removal of some of our very best judges who, acting on principle and with reverence and trueness to the Constitution, make decisions that are very politically unpopular. We talked about those last week, I think. We look at the Supreme Court of California. We look at the Supreme Court of Iowa. And I think that's such a fine example, worth repeating, or maybe I didn't mention it last time. The US Supreme Court decided the case of Obergefell, finding same-sex marriage to be constitutional, or, to phrase it accurately, finding that a state law prohibition of same-sex marriage was unconstitutional. So remember, Supreme Courts in situations like these are not saying, this is what we want, this is what we like. They are saying, under the Constitution, that enactment, that law is improper. Matter of policy, matter of preference, you can consider all sorts of things. We are simply reaching the conclusion that the prohibition of same-sex marriage is unconstitutional. That's what the Iowa Supreme Court decided. It decided that 5 years before Obergefell came to the same conclusion. So we've got the Iowa Supreme Court making the decision. 5 years later, the US Supreme Court makes the same decision. And in those 5 years, guess what happened? The 3 Iowa Supreme Court justices who came up for retention were thrown off the court. Now, I don't know those 3 justices. I've not interviewed them, but I'm guessing just by law of averages. If I picked up the phone today and called all 3 and say, how do you feel about same-sex marriage? I then have to clarify, no. Not how do you think constitutionally it should be viewed, but in your gut, how do you feel about it? I'm guessing that at least 1 or 2 out of 3 would have said, I'm kind of old school. I'm not so sure I'm comfortable with that. So we need to understand and remind ourselves that sometimes the very finest judges make decisions with which they, in their heart of hearts, disagree. We need to remind ourselves that Roe versus Wade was authored by Justice Harry Blackmun, a Catholic, absolutely against abortion. And so this is where we really, as they say, where the rubber hits the road. Judges at their best are not deciding, what do I want? What do I like? What do I prefer? They often are deciding, do I have the integrity to reach the decision required by this little constitution, even though I'm not crazy about that. And when I decided to become a judge, not a legislator, I accepted an oath to set aside my legislative preferences. At most, if I'm writing the opinion for an appellate court that will set precedent, some say I shouldn't even do this, but so many judges do it, it's come to be accepted, that the judges will say, and you'll read it in so many opinions, we reach this conclusion as a matter of constitutional law. We remind all, however, that this does not necessarily reflect a preference of anyone on this court. We just remind all that added question is something for legislative, not judicial consideration. And generally when that kind of dicta, it's called the dicta, it's not really the ruling of the case, it's venturing an opinion beyond what the case required. And not infrequently, appellate decisions go there. It's sending a signal. It's saying, we're not thrilled with what we had to decide. And we think it would be a pretty nice idea if the legislature would take our cue, take our hint, and take a look at this to see if a new law or if a revised law would provide for a better society. So that's the rubber hitting the road. And best practices of judges urge that we help remind ourselves and the judges themselves that we understand the difference between legislators and judges. And that's where we also can fall into a political trap. How many times in our lifetimes have we heard people say, judges shouldn't legislate from the bench. Judges shouldn't legislate from the bench. And I got another question about it just yesterday about, I can find it here, but I remember basically it was one of the many questions I get on originalism. Shouldn't judges just look at the law and apply it and end of discussion? Yes, they should. What's the problem? They can't always do that. And all this stuff about originalism is such a political farce. Originalism in the hands of a scholar, in the hands of Justice Scalia, in the hands of most judges, really, most judges, is perfectly fine. And there's no disagreement on that point. There is no disagreement between liberal judges and conservative judges on what the design is and what the approach should be. And it is basic. If I covered it last week, okay, worth repeating. In every case, the judge, when he or she has to look at a statute, has to look at the Constitution, that's not always at issue, but often it is, the judge picks up the statute book, This Constitution is in a sense, a statute book. It's the original and most important, and the supreme statute book. And if you can go to this book or the federal statutes or the state statutes, and you're looking at that and say, well, let's see, this issue seems to fall under this topic. Let me see if the Constitution or the statute says anything about, oh, sure enough, there it is. Let's see. And the judge then reads in open court or writes in the appellate decision, here is the legal fulcrum. These are the words. And then every judge, liberal and conservative, by design, asks this question. Are those words clear, unambiguous, and do they resolve the question that's before us today? If the answer is yes, end of case. Done. Apply it as written. Done. Even if you don't like it. Done. That's it. That's originalism. And we all hold to it, except, here and there's the judicial renegade who says, I don't really care what the law says. This is my court. I'm going my own way. It happens. And then that judge is reversed by the next higher court. But what if the words aren't clear and unambiguous? What if those words don't resolve the case? Some strange original say, oh no, that's never there. They're just being silly, stupid. Liberal and conservative, stupid. Accept that. There are some stupid judges who are unprincipled and just can't get it straight. But 99% understand this, liberals and conservatives. And if they find that the words of that statute are not clear, are not unambiguous, or they really don't necessarily apply, they then go to the next step of analysis, and that involves interpretation. The first level of interpretation can be straightforward and relatively easy. You say, well, gee, I'll bet we're not the first ones who ever encountered this question. Let's take a look at the precedents, decisions made before we came on the scene by appellate judges who had much the same or even the identical issue, who had to interpret this unclear statute and did so. If I'm in Virginia, if I'm a judge in Virginia, I look to the highest court of Virginia and see if Virginia has addressed that. In the absence of the highest court of Virginia, I'll look to the second highest court of Virginia. Virginia's typical. It's going to have me sitting here in the trial court, looking to my state's state Supreme Court, or next level, my state's Court of Appeals. Different names, different places. Get the picture. And then I'm simply accepting the very importance of humility in decision-making. That it's not a question of what I want or what I believe. If there's some higher authority that can provide guidance and it applies to this case, end of discussion. And often that's exactly how it works. It's not originalism, it's interpretation by going to sources that go beyond the original text. Everybody knows that's legitimate. Liberals and conservative judges do it. But what if you don't have a precedent? You go to the next level. And the next level searches for other sources. Logic, history, sociology, common sense, gut feeling, you name it. A lot of these things, science, we still think it's around to help us make a fair, intelligent, logical resolution. And because all judges have been schooled, trained, and have had years of practice applying this three-step, originalism, reference to precedent, reference to other stuff as appropriate to the case. And with that, we know that those who are pounding their fists and invoking originalism either are ignorant, uninformed, stupid, unprincipled, or just out on a con game to fool us. Don't let it happen. And on this, liberals and conservatives who are intellectually honest, historically accurate, and legally schooled are in complete agreement. So your antenna should just, bells should start ringing when you hear some politician, or judge for that matter, kind of pound fists, say, originalism, don't legislate from the bench. Don't swallow it. Don't be fooled.
Okay, the Golds have a question. Can you unmute? And
yeah, I had a couple points. One was that trying to elect judges or justices will limit their terms so that we can get them more in tune with their public, if you will. People have got to remember that, for instance, Earl Warren, most conservative governor of California, became the most liberal chief justice. Then we had John Paul Stevens, a conservative Republican, who became the leader of the liberals on the court. And you had David Souter, the same way. And then you had on the other side, you had, oh my goodness, you had was a White, Justice White.
Yeah, appointed by President Kennedy.
Good friend of Kennedy's, who became one of his real opponents as a conservative. So you never know which way it turns. Going to the point of legislating from the bench, Sandra Day O'Connor said that whoever loses accuses the other one of legislating from the bench.
Very often so.
Doesn't matter. Anyway, those are just a couple thoughts.
Yeah, no, you're quite right. And that's why I have even, I think I expressed my rather negative view of President Trump, and yet my essay starts, judicial independence in America is dying, but not due to Donald Trump. And that reflects my understanding that his appointees have life tenure, and if they are human, like so many who have come before them, they are not as predictable as many say. And that is why I was not surprised to see Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, and Coney Barrett vote against President Trump's cause when it came in its way to the US Supreme Court. And that's why I am not surprised that federal judges, including those appointed by Trump, consistently voted against his ludicrous, frivolous arguments. I was heartened, however, and somewhat surprised that state judges did so consistently. I think it just reaches the point where, the Trump positions were so outrageous that, there are not words. And all judges agreed. And it reached the point where even highly political, extremely conservative state judges just saw those arguments and said, no, even I, loving President Trump, cannot get myself to swallow that garbage. So these last weeks have been encouraging ones for the independent judiciary. We're not out of the woods, but at least there were some reassuring signs that came with those 60 or so decisions, federal and state, liberal and conservative.
Okay, this should be a quick question. Has any state tried having a nonpartisan or bipartisan commission to appoint or vet recommended state judges for appointment? If so, how did it work?
Yes, there are many states that have merit selection processes, commissions, sometimes here and there established by statute, but most often by a governor's practice. And I came through that merit selection process, and it was a hybrid. It was a hybrid of the governor's creation, and it could change within that governor's term. It could change as it went from one governor to the next. But my process was, I don't know if there are others just like it, but it wasn't all that unusual. The governor, I was appointed by a Republican governor. He's a very independent guy. He said, I will not consider for appointment anyone who does not get through the merit selection panel. The panel will consist of, and I think the panel in his day had the dean of the Marquette Law School, the dean of the Wisconsin Law School, the head of the Democratic Party, the head of the Republican Party, some citizen representatives, people everybody would applaud and knew through a career of service or philanthropy or whatever, respected members of the community. That panel was the first to receive the dozens of written applications and letters of recommendation, narrowed it to, I don't know, I can't remember, maybe the 10 they decided to interview. They then, from the 10 they interviewed, sent on 5 or 6 names to the governor. And I think most would agree, every person who reached that level was a respected lawyer or judge. And then people conceded it. Okay, these are all good people. Now there's nothing inherently wrong with a governor now being able to choose from among this fine group to find someone who is philosophically compatible. But when I was interviewed, I was asked about by the governor's appointments council and by these panels. I was asked about my political background and advocacy, activism, whatever it might be. I answered their questions, but I thought they were perfectly reasonable questions. And I never got the sense that my selection was going to depend on my answer unless I said something just utterly outrageous. Well, I relinquished my membership in the Ku Klux Klan last month. We chuckle now, but no. Justice Hugo Black was a member of the Ku Klux Klan and got appointed by Franklin D. Roosevelt nonetheless, and proved to be one of the most liberal civil rights, pro-civil rights justices in our history. So there's some pretty surprising things in one's background. And I think it was more are there skeletons in your closet kinds of questions, because in my state, as in 39 states, the governor appointing me knows that I have to stand for election very soon. And it would be irresponsible to not dig for skeletons in the closet with questions like those to see if I'm just going to be a judge for a very brief time until someone runs against me and knocks me off. So there are lots of states that certainly tip their hats to a merit selection process. Some governors believe very strongly in judicial independence. Others believe very strongly in finding someone who politically is loyal and will virtually rubber stamp every decision made by the legislature if it's one you favor. So yeah, we've got quite a few plans like that throughout the states. And
but that one was
I detail that and distinguish the Missouri plan retention system from the non-Missouri plan states that have re-election systems, some partisan, some not.
So your state had kind of a hybrid between the appointment and then the retention was by election.
Yes, it was not retention. It was people could run against me. It was not a retention election. Also, I should clarify, I went through the appointment process initially because there was a vacancy. If someone had simply retired at the end of the term, I would not have gone through that. I could run for office. And that would have been unrealistic. I had no money. I was a prosecutor on a public servant's salary. No, I had no money to run for office. If I wasn't going to get an appointment, I wasn't going to get to the bench. Once I had incumbency, I was in a better position to be able to run. And I was appointed in July. I had to stand for election the following April. Some states, you've got to expose yourself at the next available election. Other states, you fill out the term. Different states, different systems. And yes, hybrid, appointment, merit, election, re-election, partisan, nonpartisan, 50 different systems. None, however, like the federal system that provides life tenure.
So how well do you think they work, depending on how they're constituted?
How well do I think they work?
Yeah, the different flavors of these things.
Yeah, I think some work very well. I think some governors are very responsible and take this very seriously, Republican and Democratic. When I was interviewed, I said, look, I worked for George McGovern for 2 years. If that disqualifies me in the estimation of a Republican governor, I understand, I respect that, but I don't want to hide that. Well, for whatever bizarre reasons, he did, but I got to add this. He had already announced that he was not running for re-election. It's like when the other team's offsides, and you get to throw for the end zone, no harm can come. And so I think I was fortunate with the timing that Republican governor didn't have to kiss anybody's butt. He wasn't running for re-election. So why not take a chance on this weird bearded guy from Milwaukee?
Thank you.
There was an interesting question. First of all, there's some that I haven't reached. There were some really wonderful questions about the Cherokee Indians case, and I do not have the expertise to respond to those. I was hoping that I would get to do more research, and I was not able to do that in a way that I thought was adequate. There was a very interesting question here. I'd be interested in your thoughts regarding the activities of the wife of Justice Clarence Thomas. Are there cases in which he should recuse because of her activities and statements? Apparently he has concluded no, there haven't been any such cases. He has concluded of impropriety, he can still be fair. And I talked about that a bit last week and the potential influence of my wife and my decision-making, good or bad. Should I have disqualified myself from the abortion case? Fair question. And notwithstanding the pains I took to clarify that in the book, I say, what didn't I disclose? Should that have made a difference? I don't know what Mrs. Thomas has been up to. I've read a paragraph here and there. I don't know the extent to which they confer. Guess what? Marital relationships can be unusual. And while some people would say, well, of course they talk about these things. Not necessarily. Don't know. I would commend to your reading. It's such an important case. It's really one of the 4 key cases I discuss in part 3 of the book, the case involving the Massey Coal Company and the campaign contribution in the millions of dollars to get the Supreme Court of West Virginia to decide a case in a particular way. And the issue in the case was whether a justice of the West Virginia Supreme Court should have disqualified himself. The Supreme Court decides that case. And it's the only case we have, and it was decided just rather recently. I think it was about 15 years ago or so. And it's the only definitive recent word we have from the US Supreme Court on such questions that would go directly to the issue of whether Justice Thomas should be recusing himself from certain cases. The cases from 2009, Google it. It is called Caperton, Caperton, Caperton versus the Massey Coal Company, Inc. Massey, Massey. You just pop in Massey or Caperton, you will get to read that opinion, and you will get to read how the majority says, you know, there's this thing in law, let's call it the smell test. Does it pass the smell test? My words, not theirs. But that's in part what they're describing in deciding whether judges should disqualify. But guess what? The decision to recuse, to take oneself off the case, or to more frequently decline to do so, is almost never, ever, 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 ever reversed. The practice and the law are both. We defer to the conscience of the judge, even when millions of dollars in campaign contributions are involved. Read what the Supreme Court wrote and how it concedes the inadequacy of its decision. It's not comfortable with it. And that will, I think, give you great fascination and further guidance on that question. I know our time is late. I wanted to see if I can just steal the last minute by letting you know, in part, how I close my book. So, again, happy to stay and answer questions. I don't want to impose on anyone, and I don't want to invade the time that's might be coming up for a next OLLI course. But I won't leave until Meg says, yeah, they've had enough of you. So don't worry about that. But I do want to share with all of you before you leave how I, in part, conclude this book. I started, remember, in Russia. I end in another country in the afterword. To many Americans, judicial independence may seem theoretical. Its prominence in the revolutionary cause and constitutional formation largely forgotten. While casually respected, judicial independence is hardly an ideal around which we would expect the masses to rally. But not so abroad, not so in China or Chile or Russia or Poland or Hungary or in Germany, where a few years ago I was a Fulbright Fellow at the University of Gießen Law School. There I was hosted by the law school's wonderful dean, Professor Walter Grupp. In World War II, Professor Grupp's father fought for the German army. My father served in the US Army Air Corps. Walter and his wife Inga took my wife Karen and me to visit quiet sites, including a churchyard where 49 martyred nuns were buried, remembered for their righteous resistance to the Nazis. By coming together in true friendship, in both teaching law and pausing at these graves, Walter and I felt we were honoring not only these brave women, but our beloved fathers as well. In Germany, many memorials recall what happened when judicial independence died. But in America, it seems we allow our memories to dim, as if we want to pretend that that could never happen here. So we ignore our history of judicial corruptions and acquiescence, from Japanese American internment to African American mass incarceration. And we have yet to recognize or respond to today's unprecedented evisceration of judicial independence. Now, this book was just published 2 years ago. Those words were written, I would guess, about, 3.5 years ago when I was pulling together the afterword. And humbled again I am. Because those last words are no longer so. And we have yet to recognize or respond to today's unprecedented evisceration of judicial independence. Thank goodness, in recent years, we have come to recognize what our despot has attempted. We have come to recognize what others are attempting in the very selection of our judges. So recognition has come, perhaps like never before, in just the recent months of our lives. The other part said, we've yet to recognize or respond to today's unprecedented evisceration of judicial independence. I would say the jury's still out. And whether we respond to this attempted evisceration of judicial independence, without which Congressman Rutledge told us in 1802, without which the great interests of the people will not be safe, whether we will respond successfully, is exactly what last week's trial was about, is exactly about the trials and tribulations coming. Thank you for taking these hours together over 2 weeks to be better armed so that we will be able to go into battle, not trial by combat, but battle with understanding, compassion, pure motives, seeking justice, not for ourselves, but for our grandchildren.